getting you a voice and a flavor on the subject, which has got to do with macro changes which are silently happening in the economy. And one economist who's taking note of such silent changes is Dr. S.K. Ghosh, who's again joining us today to talk about a very interesting observation he's made in his latest note. Dr. Ghosh, good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us. I just went through your note, and the subject you've chosen to write about and dig deeper into has been the topic of the discussion for the last almost 2 years, whether the economy is taking a K-shaped recovery route. And we thought of debunking this. Is this a myth or a reality via the discussion we are going to have today? So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Ghosh. Talk to us about this. You thought about writing about this and going deeper about it. And what were your key observations? Whether indeed our country is witnessing a K-shaped route, lower end of the economy at a different pace and the higher end of the economy at a different pace, or you think this is actually a myth?
Yeah. Thank you, Ajay, for having me on the show. Let me first clarify that I have been seeing some of the comments also. Let me first clarify that this report is not only about the income taxpayer. This is also a report about all the consumption expenditure in the country, which adds up to 100%, including those at the bottom of the pyramid. So let us start with those at the bottom of the pyramid, because it is often discussed that this K-shaped recovery has to do with, and it was a term which was being coined by a professor at Virginia Mary University, and he also may have never thought that this will carry the fancy of a lot of person. But coming to this person, I think we have given an estimate that about 8.5% of the overall population in the country is actually having 65% on the consumption. This is basically as per the World Bank definition. What we did was that we tried to find out whether there was a decline in the share of consumption of this top 10% of the population in the last 3 years, given that there has been a lot of food, shelter, medical has been given by the government. We found out that this ratio of this 65% of the overall consumption in private final consumption expenditure has possibly declined to close to 60% for this 8.5% or around 10% of the population. So that is basically around 8.2 trillion. So what I'm trying to say is that 8.2 trillion consumption expenditure may have possibly shifted from the top of the pyramid to the bottom of the pyramid. And the important point to note is that even at this rate, on a conservative basis, if this trend continues, because the government has already announced that it will announce free food, then this number could actually, an additional 16 trillion could actually move from the top to the bottom. So basically by 2030, or maybe a little earlier than that, 50% of the overall consumption will be done by 90% of the people, which today, before the pandemic started, was at 65%. So I think if this is the number which we are looking at, and this number is already at 60%, in terms of percentage, it may always look great, but in terms of absolute number, 8.2 trillion is not a small number in terms of the consumption shift. So that actually one of the myths that the poorer people have been suffering. Of course, there has been suffering across the segment in the pandemic, and you can't help that. But to continue harping that it has continued, I think that may be a misnomer. The second point which you have noted, and it's an interesting observation, is that you may have seen in a lot of articles, there has been articles regarding two-wheeler sales, regarding gold, regarding land holdings as a matter of distress. Let me put out these numbers. I think in our presentation, we have shown that two-wheeler sales is actually peaked at the years, I think the year was around 15-16, when the monsoon deficiency was at its worst. And so therefore, it is always, it's maybe a little bit foolhardy to say is that the sale of the two-wheelers is actually tied to the complete happiness in the rural market. Of course, rural is one of the phenomenon, but it may be difficult to say that. In this year, we are projecting that the total two-wheeler sales could be around 1.8 trillion. But the important point to that is if you look into a trend diagram of two-wheelers and four-wheelers, you'll find that there has been a steady substitution of two-wheelers by the four-wheelers, by those at the four-wheelers. If you look into the loan side also, which we have given, that gives an higher size of the loan, which is being taken by individuals to buying and four-wheelers. And the other important thing is that I think for two-wheelers also, I think there has been, in economics, you often call a term as give and good. That means if income goes up, the consumption of that item doesn't actually go up, that actually goes down. So maybe people are actually shifting from two-wheelers to four-wheelers, and it may be again incorrect to say that the decline in the two-wheeler sales was because of this distress. So I think maybe a little bit is possible, but not the entire thing. The second thing also, which are not written in the report, and I'll bypass that lack of time, is also the gold sales. The gold loans are actually given to the more prosperous states in the south. It's basically the southern states takes more of gold loans. So if that is taken as a matter of distress to the southern states, the gold loans, I think that is also incorrect. Now, so these are basically the story of the informal part. Coming to the formal part, which is basically the tax-paying individuals today, which is around 37% of the formal labor force. I think you have seen the findings in our report. A movement of around, I think, close to more than 30% of the people, I think close to 40% are moving from the lower end tax bracket to the higher end tax bracket. Close to 20% of the farms are moving from the lower end of the value chain to the higher end of the value chain. And this is also substantiated by the RBI report on trends in currency and finance. And also the fact that the average weighted mean income, where we have clearly stated what is the weight in each class, which is the midpoint of that particular salaried class, have moved from around 4 lakhs to 13 lakhs. So, and also the income distribution, if you look into the curve, which was at FY14 and FY22, FY14, we had a curve which was actually left heavy. And in FY22, we have a curve which is right heavy, or basically more distributed like a normal distribution. So I think all these point outs was the fact that there has been a redistribution of income from across all income classes. We may always debate that the distribution of income should have been faster. I am completely amenable to that argument, but to say that everything is basically a K-shape doesn't fit the data, at least, which we have studied available in public domain.
Very valid point, Dr. Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh, so clearly you're making the data you bring to the table is actually strengthening the argument that income inequality in our country by hard facts and data is actually reducing. Talk to us about sort of being a practicing economist, when these turns actually start happening. Be it the demographic profile change, be it some of the efforts being taken from the government side. When this kind of process has started, does it carry on? Is it prolonged? What is the longevity of this? Because we are kind of getting into a high growth, prolonged kind of a period. Do you think this phenomena to continue?
No, I think that's a very valid question, Ajay. And I think this is also, recently the government announced, I think the Honorable Prime Minister announced that the extension of these free food grains for the 5 years. Whenever some of the many arguments which have been made by people is that giving free food grains to 80 crore of the population is actually a sign of the distress. I don't agree with that argument, because simply if you are giving food grains to the 80 crore people of the country, possibly mostly at the bottom of the pyramid, that only means that you are actually helping them to save their money. Because giving food to them on a free basis, on a monthly basis, if you are giving shelter to them, if you are giving medical to them, I think all of these actually lifts the social infrastructure. Also empowering the woman in terms of the bank loans, which we have seen in several of the initiatives the government is giving, actually it builds up a social infrastructure. So anything which builds up a social infrastructure and puts more money into the hands of the people. And please note that this is very difficult to measure, because when you are giving some the social infrastructure to the poor people in terms of saving money, it's very difficult to mention how much money they have saved, and therefore there is so much noise that this poor may have suffered. But my point is that I think these measures of extending it to the food grains for the next 4 to 5 years is a laudable step, because many may consider this as a time that we are trying to help them, but holding their hands in terms of the progress. Because in a huge country like us, there could be always some amount of inequality, and nobody denies that, because growth and inequality goes together. At the end of the day, there is some amount, but the point is how we are able to reduce that inequality over an extended period. And nobody is denying that. I have also said in my report that the top 10% actually 65% of the consumption. So that is actually a sign of the inequality, which has, however, reduced. So my point is that if we continue doing these measures to handhold the poor people, I think we will actually end up in a situation when the poor people consumption share should increase in terms of incremental terms. A lot of people at the bottom of the pyramid are not able to access the banking system. Earlier, they had taken deposits. Now they have taken credit. This was actually one of the studies in terms of the Shonedi sample. So these are some of the changes which we must appreciate. And at the end of the day, these changes, if we do, and we take all of us together in our quest for growth, I think we should get into some sort of an inclusive development.
Outstanding, very good. Thank you very much for your inputs, sharing your inputs. In fact, alluding to that credit growth data, look at how bottom of the pyramid lenders, microfinance, small finance banks, SMEs, the kind of scorching pace growth is actually, so it's in the listed universe too, we are coming across that kind. Dr. Ghosh, thank you very much for sparing time for this conversation this afternoon.
Thank you.
All right, with that.